The story of the 10 plagues of Egypt, as described in the book of Exodus, is a rich and dramatic tale about the power of God, the stubbornness of Pharaoh, and the liberation of the Israelites from slavery. It teaches profound lessons about obedience, pride, divine judgment, and mercy. Through this story, God uses 10 powerful signs, or plagues, to show his supremacy over the Egyptian gods and to compel Pharaoh to release the Israelites. The Israelites' plight and Moses' calling. The backdrop of the story begins with the suffering of the Israelites. Centuries earlier, the descendants of Jacob, also known as Israel, had come to Egypt during a time of famine. At first, they were welcomed because of the high status of Joseph, one of Jacob's sons, who had risen to power in Egypt. However, over the generations, the Israelites multiplied and became numerous, which alarmed the Egyptian rulers. The Pharaoh of that time, fearing their potential strength, enslaved them and subjected them to harsh labor. The Israelites cried out to God for deliverance, and he heard their pleas. God chose Moses, an Israelite raised in Pharaoh's court, to lead his people out of Egypt. Moses, initially hesitant and unsure of his abilities, was called by God through a miraculous encounter at the burning bush. Empowered by God, Moses returned to Egypt, accompanied by his brother Aaron, to confront Pharaoh and demand the release of the Israelites. Moses' first confrontation with Pharaoh. Moses and Aaron appeared before Pharaoh and delivered God's command, "Let my people go, so that they may worship me." Pharaoh, who viewed himself as a god and ruler of the most powerful empire on earth, scoffed at this request. He refused to release the Israelites, and instead, he made their burdens even heavier, commanding that the slaves make bricks without providing the necessary straw. The people's suffering increased, and they grew angry with Moses. However, God reassured Moses that he would demonstrate his power in Egypt and force Pharaoh to relent. God's plan was to bring about a series of plagues that would make it undeniable that he was the true and only God, superior to the many gods worshipped in Egypt. The first plague, water turns to blood. The first of the 10 plagues began with the Nile River, the lifeblood of Egypt. The Nile provided Egypt with water, food, and transportation. The Egyptians revered it as sacred. God, through Moses, turned this source of life into a source of death. When Moses stretched out his staff over the Nile, its waters turned to blood. Fish died, the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink the water. This plague lasted for 7 days, and all the water in Egypt, even in ponds and containers, turned to blood. Despite the destruction and discomfort, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. His magicians were able to replicate the effect on a small scale, which gave Pharaoh reason to dismiss Moses' miracle. He refused to let the Israelites go. The second plague, frogs. After Pharaoh's continued defiance, God sent the second plague. Frogs emerged from the Nile in vast numbers and covered the land of Egypt. Frogs invaded homes, kitchens, and even Pharaoh's palace. They were in every bed, oven, and kneading bowl. The people were overwhelmed by the sheer number of frogs, which disrupted daily life and caused widespread disgust. Pharaoh was so frustrated by the invasion of frogs that he called for Moses and Aaron, begging them to ask God to remove the frogs. He promised to let the Israelites go if the plague was lifted. Moses prayed, and the frogs died, leaving their bodies piled up in heaps, causing the land to stink. However, once the frogs were gone, Pharaoh hardened his heart again and broke his promise, refusing to let the Israelites leave. The third plague, gnats, lice. God continued to send plagues to demonstrate his power. For the third plague, Aaron stretched out his staff and struck the dust of the earth, which turned into gnats, or lice, that swarmed over people and animals. The gnats were everywhere, irritating both the Egyptians and their livestock. This time, the magicians of Egypt could not replicate the plague. They admitted to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." Despite this acknowledgement, Pharaoh remained stubborn and refused to release the Israelites. His heart grew harder with each plague. The fourth plague, flies. Next came swarms of flies, which filled the houses and covered the land of Egypt. These swarms were so thick that they darkened the skies and caused great suffering. The Bible notes that while Egypt was overrun by flies, the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was spared. This distinction showed that God was protecting his people while punishing the Egyptians. Pharaoh once again summoned Moses and offered a compromise. The Israelites could worship their God, but they had to do it within Egypt. Moses refused, explaining that the Israelites needed to leave Egypt entirely to properly worship God. Pharaoh agreed to let them go, but only temporarily. However, after the flies were removed, Pharaoh hardened his heart again and broke his promise. The fifth plague, livestock diseased. The fifth plague struck Egypt's livestock. A terrible disease killed all the horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats of the Egyptians. This was a devastating blow to Egypt's economy and agricultural system. Once again, the Israelites' livestock was unaffected, showing God's distinction between his people and the Egyptians. Despite the immense loss of livestock, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he refused to free the Israelites. The sixth plague, boils. The sixth plague affected the people of Egypt directly. Moses and Aaron took handfuls of soot from a furnace and threw it into the air in Pharaoh's presence. The soot became fine dust that spread throughout the land, causing painful boils to break out on people and animals. The boils were so severe that even Pharaoh's magicians were afflicted and could not stand before Moses. Despite the personal suffering of his people and the unbearable pain caused by the boils, Pharaoh refused to humble himself before God. His heart grew even harder, and he continued to resist. The seventh plague, hail. For the seventh plague, God warned Pharaoh of a coming storm. Moses told Pharaoh that a hailstorm unlike any Egypt had ever seen would come, and it would destroy everything left out in the open. Some of Pharaoh's officials, who by this point had begun to fear God's power, heeded the warning and brought their servants and livestock inside. Others ignored the warning and left their possessions and people in the fields. When the hailstorm came, it was accompanied by thunder, lightning, and fire. The hail was so large and powerful that it destroyed crops, killed livestock, and shattered trees. The storm caused widespread destruction across Egypt, except in Goshen, where the Israelites were spared once again. Pharaoh was shaken by the storm and admitted his sin. He begged Moses to stop the storm and promised to let the Israelites go. Moses prayed, and the storm ceased. But once the hail and lightning stopped, Pharaoh hardened his heart once again and refused to release the Israelites. The eighth plague, locusts. After Pharaoh's repeated refusal, God sent the eighth plague, locusts. A strong east wind brought swarms of locusts into Egypt, and they devoured every green plant and crop that had survived the hailstorm. The locusts covered the land and consumed everything in their path, leaving Egypt in complete devastation. Pharaoh, realizing the severity of the plague, called for Moses and Aaron. He admitted his sin and asked for their prayers to remove the locusts. Moses prayed, and God sent a west wind that blew the locusts into the Red Sea. Yet once again, Pharaoh hardened his heart and refused to let the Israelites go. The ninth plague, darkness. The ninth plague brought a supernatural darkness over Egypt. For 3 days, a thick darkness covered the land so that no one could see anything or leave their homes. The darkness was so oppressive that it could be felt. Only the Israelites had light where they lived, further proving God's protection over his people. Pharaoh, now deeply shaken, offered a final compromise. The Israelites could go, but they had to leave their livestock behind. Moses refused, explaining that they needed their animals for sacrifices. This infuriated Pharaoh, and he threatened Moses, telling him never to appear before him again, or he would die. The 10th plague, death of the firstborn. The final and most devastating plague was the death of the firstborn. God warned Moses that he would pass through Egypt, and every firstborn son, from Pharaoh's heir to the son of the lowest servant, would die. Even the firstborn of the livestock would be struck down. God instructed the Israelites to mark their doorposts with the blood of a lamb, so that the angel of death would pass over their homes, sparing their firstborn. That night, a great cry arose throughout Egypt, as every household experienced the loss of a firstborn. Pharaoh's own son was among the dead. Devastated, Pharaoh finally relented. He summoned Moses and Aaron during the night and ordered them to leave Egypt immediately, taking all the Israelites with them. The story of the 10 plagues of Egypt, as described in the book of Exodus, serves as a powerful narrative of divine intervention, human pride, and the ultimate triumph of faith. Each plague, ranging from the Nile turning to blood, to frogs, gnats, and locusts, to darkness, and finally the death of the firstborn, was a clear demonstration of God's supreme power over the Egyptian gods and nature itself. Through these dramatic events, God not only judged Pharaoh's stubbornness, but also liberated the Israelites from centuries of enslavement. At the heart of this story is the contrast between Pharaoh's hardened heart and Moses' unwavering faith in God's promise. Despite witnessing the devastation of his people, Pharaoh's pride and refusal to submit led to Egypt's downfall. On the other hand, the Israelites, led by Moses, experienced God's protection and deliverance, culminating in their exodus from Egypt. The final act, where God parts the Red Sea, symbolized both the end of Israel's captivity and the complete destruction of Pharaoh's army, showing that no human power can stand against divine will. The 10 plagues teach profound lessons about the dangers of arrogance, the importance of obedience to God, and the consequences of defying moral and spiritual authority. It underscores that while divine judgment may be severe, God's mercy and deliverance are equally powerful. The story remains a cornerstone of biblical history, reminding us of the lengths to which God will go to fulfill His promises and deliver His people from oppression.